Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. I welcome you all to another discussion topic, that is romantic elements in Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Now, before going to discuss the elements of romanticism in the poem, we need to understand what basically is romanticism. Although there can be a number of definitions and a number of explanation or analysis of the word romanticism, but to be very precise, the word romanticism is derived from the word romance, and it simply means free play of imagination. Free play of imagination means when you don't put any restriction to your imagination. Although imagination is never restricted, but in the neoclassical era, this imagination or the scope of imagination was very much limited to the day-to-day life and day-to-day activities of every human being. But in Romantic era, the scope of imagination was widened, and whatever a poet thought, he composed it. As we can see, Kubla Khan by Coleridge. Now, Kubla Khan is a pure work of imagination because it has no relation with the day-to-day life. It has nothing to do with the practical life. It is a pure example of imagination. Why? Because there is no restraint or no limit to imaginative thought, and the writer has composed whatever his imagination has asked him to do. Romanticism is basically the free play of imagination, and this romanticism is basically an era in English poetry where a group of poets have tried to incorporate the free play of imagination in their artistic works. And it is also a reaction to the neoclassical era, in which the poetry was very much limited in its scope and in terms of imagination. The very first characteristic of romanticism is imagination, and as we have discussed that this romantic era, the poets in romantic era dealt with imagination in its full bloom, in its full scope. They did not try to limit imaginative thought or imaginative process. They tried to write whatever they thought, because Coleridge, he believes that imagination is the vehicle of truth, because whatever you think that is true, it is basically the voice of your heart. Like what you compose with the practice and with those intentions is something different than what you think and write abruptly. Although you have to apply certain filters, but your thought process is actually very true in nature. Why? Because what you feel is what you imagine, and then you write it. So there is no restriction, there is no limit to it. And this is the first characteristic of Romantic era, that is free play of imagination. And one more thing that is very important, as we have discussed in the previous slide, that there is great difference between the perception of imagination in the neoclassical era and the perception of imagination in the Romantic era. In the neoclassical era, imagination was very much limited. Imagination of supernatural or imagination of something that is not basically practical in life was restricted, was not allowed at all, and writers could not write about it. Why? Because the trend of the society was like that. But in Romantic era, imagination was something going beyond the practical life, going beyond the incorporation of all those elements in the life. So Kubla Khan, Christabel, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Ode to the West Wind, and so many other examples can be taken as an example of this free play of imagination. Now, coming specifically towards this poem, although this poem is a properly or completely imaginative poem, like the whole structure and the whole fabric of this poem is based on imagination, but to be very precise in simple words, Coleridge wants to tell us that we need to treat those heavenly birds or those heavenly creatures respectively, and we should not kill them without any reason. Although if there is a reason, we should not kill them then as well, but without a reason we must never kill them. So for this very reason, he makes a poem, and then this is purely imagination, that the crew members and a mariner go on a voyage, and then incidents happen, and the whole story that we have already discussed. So this is imagination without any boundary. Now, coming towards the second major characteristic of Romantic era or Romantic poetry, it is nature. We need to understand that there is a difference between the treatment of nature in neoclassical poetry and Romantic poetry. Nature for the neoclassical poets meant nature of people, treatment of people or the interaction among people, while nature for the romantic poets literally meant nature. Sceneries, pleasant weather, bad weather, mountains, rustic environment. So for romantic poets, nature means nature, and they have dealt nature the way nature should be dealt. This poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, is replete with the scenes of nature. We see pleasant weather when the voyage of the mariner starts. Then we see the pleasant weather turning into the worst weather, snowstorms and hails and clouds. Then again we see different weather. Then towards the end we see this wedding. So all these are basically sceneries, basically images, or these are like the part of our nature, the part of the outside nature, the part of the nature through which the mood is made, through which our internal mood shift and the way we perceive it. So nature is dealt in the way nature should be dealt. So in this poem there are so many scenes, or the whole fabric of this poem is built around nature. So this is the second characteristic of romantic poetry, and in this romantic poetry we have seen how Rime of the Ancient Mariner deals with this. Another important characteristic of romantic poetry is the presence of supernatural elements. Now, supernatural elements are the elements that are beyond nature, or that do not physically exist, but they are in abstract shape. Means the spirits, the ghosts, fairies, and other things. Supernaturalism was dealt mainly associated with castles and with palaces, the horror and gothic elements. But in romantic poetry, this concept of supernaturalism was given another dimension. They start playing an important role in the lives of people. Similar is the case with this Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We see a lot of supernatural elements. Even this character of mariner, it is a sort of supernatural element. Like when it is analyzed deeply, we come across this concept whether he actually was a mariner or he was a supernatural element. Similarly, albatross is another supernatural element, although it is used as a symbol, but it has got this force of supernaturalism. Why? Because when this albatross come, everything is fine for the mariner, but when it is killed, everything gets changed. Similarly, the skeleton ship is another force. The white woman. So all these are basically symbols, but these symbols carry supernatural forces, and this is the whole structure of this poem as well. That although this poem wants to convey a moral message, although the mariner is in charge, but the force that is playing the pivotal role in this poem is the concept of supernatural forces or supernatural elements. This is how the Romantic poets have composed their poetry, by the incorporation of supernatural elements, imaginative elements, and treatment of nature. Although there are so many other characteristics of Romantic poetry, but these are the major ones, and the Rime of the Ancient Mariner has all those major characteristics of Romantic poetry and Romanticism. I hope the concept of the elements of Romantic poetry or Romanticism are very much clear. Still, if there is any question, you can put it in the comment box and I'll try to answer. Till then, thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.